In the 19th century, the average American drank 6 to 7 gallons of pure alcoholic beverages per year, 3 times the modern-day counterparts in the 21st century. Americans were growing tired of this. They wanted to voluntarily instigate a prohibition of alcoholic beverages. One major problem was the yearly revenue alcohol produced. In 1875, 1/3 of federal revenue came from alcohol. The solution was a national income tax. Organizations such as the Anti-Saloon League and the Progressive Movement pushed and lobbied for prohibition and the creation of the 16th Amendment. Contrary to what most people believe, prohibition was heavily influenced by taxes, and the 16th Amendment was introduced and prohibition followed. The ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913 and the first personal income tax of 1914 allowed for the growth of the Progressive Movement and prohibition to change the course of American history. Healthier livers and disappointed money givers. This is the story of prohibition and the income tax. I'm Shea Smithwick, coming at you with another episode of SOS Podcast. And as you can already tell, this episode we're going to be focusing on the ties between prohibition and the 16th Amendment. And one major party in this story was the Progressive Movement. During the Progressive era, many citizens wanted to end political corruption. They wanted to further social and political reform, increase rights for women and workers, and separate politics from large corporations. These are still many issues that we face today. When social problems such as drunkenness and poverty arose, the movement grew and gained more public attention. This movement, along with the Anti-Saloon League, would help create the first permanent income tax in American history. The first income tax introduced to the United States was in 1861. It imposed a 3% tax on annual incomes over $800. This new idea was not popular with American citizens. People felt it was unnecessary and infringed on their hard-earned money. Congress quickly repealed it due to an overwhelming amount of negative attitudes. In 1894, the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act was introduced. It introduced a 2% tax on incomes over $4,000, and it was repealed in less than a year. These instances of income tax were frowned upon, so it came as a surprise when the 16th Amendment was passed with a minimal amount of unfavorable repercussions. Despite America's opposition to previous income taxes, the 16th Amendment passed with less opposition than other attempts. One factor that may have swayed the view of Americans was that the Anti-Saloon League backed the 16th Amendment. The Anti-Saloon League was growing in popularity. As an organization, they effectively catered to the bias of different demographics in America. Immigrants, whites, black people, and workers were all told how alcohol was stopping and suppressing them. The Anti-Saloon League used their influence to support the 16th Amendment and used the income tax to fuel the inevitable prohibition. With prohibition in discussion, the 16th Amendment was seen as an alternative to the revenue alcohol produced. This income tax made it easier for the public and lawmakers to accept prohibition. Americans acknowledged drinking was at an all-time high. Prohibition became the 18th Amendment and was ratified 7 years after the 16th Amendment in 1920. The health benefits became clear instantly. During Prohibition, liver cirrhosis declined 10 to 20%. Families had more money going to consumer goods instead of alcohol. However, there were several downsides to the newly initiated Prohibition. Alcohol consumption decreased, but many people continued drinking. Mark Twain stated the failure of Prohibition best. Prohibition only drives drunkenness behind doors and into dark places. It does not cure or even diminish it. When alcohol became illegal, it became harder for the government to contain and regulate it. The Bureau of Prohibition, the main organization in charge of catching and arresting bootleggers, only had 1,500 agents covering the entire country. That was one agent for every 70,666 Americans. Mobsters such as Al Capone and Abe Bernstein began to profit from the illegal sale of alcohol. Organized crime began to grow and thrive. Prohibition introduced several problems to America, but most people supported it when it started out. The women's suffrage movement and Anti-Saloon League helped influence the 16th Amendment, but they also swayed the minds of people and politicians on the 18th Amendment. Throwing support behind Prohibition was very popular during the late 1910s. It was seen as moral and clean. As the popularity of the Anti-Saloon League's movement grew more and more, politicians saw an opportunity to grow their approval rating. Most politicians put up a front because they knew supporting prohibition was beneficial to their future re-election campaigns. Most Americans loved the idea of the dry nation, and the women's movement stated that alcohol was ruining families. The tense relations between Germans and Americans during World War I also played a part in the ratification of the 18th Amendment. America's biggest beer brewers were German or of German descent, and the progressive movement used anti-German propaganda to help paint alcohol, especially beer, in a bad light. Different factors along with the 16th Amendment helped instigate this nationwide prohibition. One major predicament was the money and yearly revenue that alcohol produced. Alcohol made up 40% of the government's annual income. In 1910 alone, this country made $200 million in alcohol. Without this money, the government would surely go bankrupt. Many believe the only solution was an income tax. Wayne Wheeler, an attorney and leader of the Anti-Saloon League, lobbied for the 16th Amendment, which would become the first permanent income tax in American history. With the creation of this new income tax, the government no longer relied on alcohol. Thus, Prohibition began until proved futile a decade later. Prohibition came to an end in 1933 under then-President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He signed the Colin-Harrison Act, which legalized the sale of beer and wine with an alcohol content of 3.2% or lower, which would shortly be raised. Many states remained dry well after Prohibition. Most notably, Oklahoma ended its prohibition in 1959, and Mississippi did it in 1966. Today, many counties across America still have a ban on alcohol. The alcohol business helped aid America through the Great Depression. It created jobs for people and generated money for the government. Even though Prohibition was gone, the income tax stayed. The ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913 and the first personal income tax of 1914 allowed for the progressive movement and Prohibition to change the course of American history. The 16th Amendment did indeed pave the way for Prohibition. Almost 70 years after Prohibition ended, the income tax remains in all but 9 states. Today, Americans want to legalize marijuana for the same reason people were able to give up the alcohol business: taxes. There is more money to be made in legalizing and taxing marijuana. States such as Washington, California, and Colorado are making well over $300 million in the tax revenue of THC-based products and recreational marijuana. Many more states could profit from decriminalizing cannabis. In the future, bigger decisions regarding tax and marijuana will inevitably be made. Moving forward, tax will influence the way government regulates modern, controversial substances. Thank you. And hey, do you like our podcast? Then you should keep listening. I'm Shea Smithwick, saying goodbye from SOS Podcast.